Albert Edmonton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to speak on Bill C-39, legislation that imposes a new arbitrary deadline of March of 2024 in place of this Liberal government's arbitrary deadline of March 2023, whereby persons with a sole underlying mental health disorder will be eligible for MAID. I support Bill C-39 only because it is better than the alternative, namely that MAID would be available to persons with a sole underlying mental disorder in one short month from now on March 17th, which would be an absolute disaster and which with certainty would result in vulnerable persons prematurely ending their lives who could have otherwise gone on to recover and lead a healthy and happy life. Rather than imposing a new arbitrary deadline that is not grounded on the basis of science and evidence, what this Liberal government should be doing is abandoning altogether this radical, reckless, and dangerous expansion of MAID. And it is why I wholeheartedly support Bill C-314, introduced last Friday by my friend and colleague, the member for Abbotsford, which will do exactly that. Mr. Speaker, one would expect that a responsible government, before deciding to expand MAID in cases of mental illness, would take the time to study the issue thoroughly and to consult widely with experts. After all, we're talking about life and death. We're talking about a significant expansion that would impact a group of Canadians that are vulnerable. But, Mr. Speaker, this Liberal government is not responsible, because that is not what happened, and it is why this government finds itself in the mess that it is in today with this rushed 11th hour legislation to delay this expansion. Instead, what the Minister of Justice did was accepted a radical Senate amendment to Bill C-7, which established an arbitrary sunset clause setting in motion this expansion of MAID in cases of mental illness effective March of 2023. To provide some context, the purpose of Bill C-7 was to remove a critical safeguard, namely that death be reasonably foreseeable before someone be eligible for MAID. It was a terrible piece of legislation in response to the Truchon decision, which this government should have appealed and didn't appeal. As bad as the bill was, when it was studied at the Justice Committee, of which I was a member at the time, nowhere in the bill was any mention of expanding MAID in cases of mental illness. And so the Justice Committee didn't hear evidence on that point. Indeed, when the minister came to committee, he said that there were inherent risks and complexities with expanding MAID in cases of mental illness, and therefore that it would be inappropriate to do so. The bill goes over to the Senate, and all of a sudden, the minister unilaterally accepts that Senate amendment. And then, what do the Liberals do? After little more than a day of debate, they shut down debate on a bill that had drastically changed in scope and rammed the legislation rammed this expansion of MAID in cases of mental illness. No meaningful study, absolutely no consultation with experts, including psychiatrists, with persons struggling with mental illness, and their advocates, nothing. In short, what this Liberal government did, what this Justice Minister did, is made the decision to go ahead with this significant expansion and then said, we'll study the issue later. Hence, the establishment of an expert panel that was appointed after the government had already made the decision to go ahead. You would think, Mr. Speaker, that if you're going to appoint an expert panel, you'd appoint the expert panel before you decide. Exactly. But not with this Justice Minister, not with this Liberal government. We saw a special joint committee established after the fact. I mean, talk about getting it backwards, Mr. Speaker. Talk about putting blind ideology and hubris ahead of science and evidence, and talk about a total disregard for the concerns and the lives of Canadians struggling with mental illness. Had this Minister of Justice and this Liberal government done the homework at the outset, what they would have learned very quickly is that this expansion of MAID cannot be implemented safely. I serve as a co-vice chair on the Special Joint Committee on Medical Assistance in Dying. And as early as the spring, we heard from multiple witnesses, representatives of the mental health community, and most importantly, with respect to some of the clinical issues, leading psychiatrists. The body of evidence was overwhelming that this cannot proceed safely. And one of the key reasons cited is that in the case of mental illness, it is difficult, if not impossible, to predict irremediability. In other words, it is difficult, if not impossible, in the case of mental illness, to determine whether someone can recover, whether they can get better, whether they can become healthy. Mr. Speaker, that's a serious, serious problem. Now, let's look at some of the evidence that was available to this minister back in the spring. For example, Dr. John Marr, a clinical psychiatrist and medical ethicist who appeared before the committee, said, quote, "Psychiatrists don't know and can't know who will get better and live decades of good life. Brain diseases are not liver diseases," end of quote. Dr. Brian Shera, also a clinical psychiatrist and professor at the University of Quebec at Montreal, told the committee, quote, "I'm a scientist. The latest Cochrane review of research on the ability to find some indicator of the future course of a mental illness, either treated or untreated, concluded that we have no specific scientific ways of doing this," end of quote. Even the government's expert panel conceded the difficulty in predicting irremediability. At page 9 of the expert panel report, the panel observed, quote, "The evolution of many mental disorders, like some other chronic conditions, is difficult to predict for a given individual. There is limited knowledge about the long-term prognosis for many conditions, and it is difficult, if not impossible, for clinicians to make accurate predictions about the future for an individual patient." Difficult, if not impossible, to predict irremediability, said the government's own expert panel. Mr. Speaker, what that means, if you cannot predict irremediability is that persons who could go on to lead a healthy and happy life will have their lives prematurely ended. And it's a problem that this government cannot avoid and that has not been resolved. Because let me remind this House, Mr. Speaker, that under the law, in order to be eligible for MAID, one must have an irremediable condition. And here we have leading experts, leading psychiatrists, including the government's own expert panel, that said it's difficult, if not impossible, to predict irremediability. And so what that means, Mr. Speaker, according to the psychiatrists who appeared before the Special Joint Committee, is that medical assessments in cases of mental illness for MAID are going to be decided on the basis of hunches and guesswork that could be wildly inaccurate. Those are the words of Dr. Mark Senior, a professor of psychiatry at the University of Toronto, who appeared before the Special Joint Committee, and they were echoed by other psychiatrists who appeared before our committee. Hunches and guesswork. The expert panel did not use such language, but they essentially conceded the point in their expert report because they were unable to come up with any objective standard by which to measure whether a patient's condition in the case of mental illness is irremediable. Instead, the expert panel ridiculously said, recklessly, both ridiculously and recklessly, said that we're going to wash our hands clean of this. We're going to give a big green light and say it can all be done on a case-by-case basis. No objective standard whatsoever. All guesswork. All subjective. Mr. Speaker, Dr. Mark Senior, at the Special Joint Committee on the issue of predicting irremediability in the context of mental illness said, with respect to physicians undertaking an assessment of the patient, that, quote, they could be making an error 2% of the time or 95% of the time, end of quote. 95%, a 95% error rate. That's the risk on a matter of life and death, on a matter of a procedure that is irreversible, that results in the termination of someone's life. Persons who are struggling with mental illness, and the government solution, the minister just stood in this place and said, damn the evidence, damn the facts, we're going full steam ahead. Mr. Speaker, I cannot think of a more reckless approach than the one that this Liberal government has taken to this issue of profound importance to so many Canadians. And Mr. Speaker, it's not just the issue of irremediability, although that, given the fact that that cannot be resolved, that should be the end of the matter. Psychiatrists and other experts at the Special Joint Committee also emphasized that in the case of mental illness, it is very difficult to distinguish between someone making a request motivated by suicidality versus a request that is being made rationally. That is having regard for the fact that suicidality is a symptom of mental illness, and indeed, 90% of persons who end their life by suicide have a diagnosable mental disorder. To illustrate how radical this government is, when the Ontario Medical Association surveyed Ontario psychiatrists in 2021, 91% said they opposed the expansion of MAID for mental illness under Bill C-7. 91%. 2% expressed support. 91% against, 2% in support, the rest undecided. It speaks to how reckless, how radical, how extreme, and how out of touch this minister and this government is on the question of expanding MAID in the case of mental illness. And, Mr. Speaker, in the face of the overwhelming evidence that we heard at committee, we issued an interim dissenting report calling on the Liberals to put a halt on this radical and reckless expansion. The minister ignored our interim dissenting report. He ignored the experts. He ignored the evidence. So blinded by ideology, it appears that it is impossible for him to see what is in plain sight, but this cannot be done safely. It took the Association of Chairs of Psychiatry in December, when it was evident that the minister was not listening, an association that includes the heads of psychiatry at all 17 medical schools, to say, put a halt to this expansion. The minister still wasn't prepared to act. Indeed, it wasn't until the day after Parliament rose for Christmas that he had a late afternoon press conference in which he made some vague commitment to introducing legislation in which there would be some type of extension. 17 sitting days before the expiration of the sunset clause, the minister finally saw fit to introduce this bill. I think this, Mr. Speaker, very clearly illustrates the shambolic approach to which this government has handled this issue. And so now we have legislation. But what does this legislation do? As I noted at the outset of my speech, it provides for a new arbitrary deadline, even though issues of irremediability, suicidality, and capacity to consent have remained unresolved for the past 2 years. There is absolutely no evidence that those issues are going to be resolved a year from now. And so, Mr. Speaker, what we have is nothing more than an arbitrary deadline, and a year from now we're going to find ourselves in exactly the same place. And let's be clear, when we speak about suicidality, irremediability, and capacity to consent, these are not issues to be brushed under the rug. These are serious legal and clinical issues that are fundamental to determining whether this can go forward. And so, Mr. Speaker, let me say in closing that whether this expansion takes place a month from now or a year from now, this expansion will be an absolute disaster and will result in persons struggling with mental illness to have their lives wrongfully terminated. It's time, Mr. Speaker, for this government to get its head out of the sand, stop being blinded by extreme ideology, follow the science, follow the evidence, and scrap this ill-conceived expansion.
Questions and comments? Question commentaire, the honourable member for Scarborough Rouge Park.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleague from St. Albert Edmonton for his comments. And at the outset, let me just say how fundamentally different view that I had of the committee hearings and of the many experts that came forward and testified at committee at the special joint committee, which is set to release its report on Friday. I do note that he mentions the expert panel, and on one side he says it's supporting his position. On the other side, he's saying that they're proposing to go ahead with MAID for those with mental health as a sole and underlying condition. And I don't think he can have it both ways, Mr. Speaker. Ultimately, the expert panel has recommended that we move forward. We've consulted with an enormous amount of individuals and organizations, and we've heard from them at committee. And I think it's very clear that we should be going forward, but there is a need for prudence. There's need to ensure that there's a little bit more time available for experts to be ready with the right training and so on. So I'm just asking the member why he is misleading in his debate on the many people that have come forward and given us a different perspective than his at committee.
The honourable member for St. Albert Edmonton.
Mr. Speaker, I'm not misleading anyone. The parliamentary secretary, if anyone is misleading, it's him, with greatest respect to him. I'm not having it both ways. I mean, he mischaracterized what I said with respect to the expert panel. I said that the expert panel acknowledged what other experts who appeared before the committee acknowledged, which is that irremediability is difficult, if not impossible, to determine. And then the expert panel washed their hands of coming up with recommendations on how it could be implemented safely. They offered no objective criteria. They said it could be done on a case-by-case basis. My point with respect to the expert panel is how flawed of a report it was, and the fact that the expert panel, the government's own expert panel, even said, just go ahead with this. If you read the fine print, provided plenty of reasons why the government should not go ahead with this, not just by extending it, but by scrapping it altogether.
Questions and comments? Question et commentaire. L'honorable député.
The honourable member from Montcalm. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My colleague from St. Albert, Edmonton, has never cited science so much. I understand that he's passionate about this, but he didn't say what the expert committee didn't say. When they talk about ending one's life prematurely, in the case of mental illness, the only way of ending one's life prematurely is if there's a suicide attempt. So you need a second expert's opinion. And so if someone is, facing possible suicide, well, a suicide attempt is reversible. So what the expert committee says on page 13 is that the incurability of a mental illness cannot be established in the absence of a multitude of different types of therapeutic interventions. So someone who's attempted suicide and then who goes through that door to seek psychiatric care, that person will have to be monitored. And they will probably never, if they're considering suicide, they will probably never have access to MAID. Because the only people who can have access to it are people who are not in the middle of a crisis and who have been followed for many years. That person needs to prove that they really did attempt all forms of possible treatment and that their situation really is irremediable. So I understand that it's a sensitive subject, but I hope that my colleague will clarify this because I'm sensing it's too ideological. The honourable member.
Mr. Speaker, I first of all want to thank the member for Montcalm, who has served on the special joint committee and is a very thoughtful member on that committee. But, Mr. Speaker, at the end of the day, I think what the member is highlighting, even though he's defending or arguing that somehow expanding MAID in cases of mental illness could be appropriate, I think actually what he's demonstrating is exactly the opposite. He's highlighting why it is inappropriate, given the fact that suicidality is a symptom of mental illness, given the fact that 90% of persons who are struggling, 90% of persons who commit suicide suffer from a diagnosable mental disorder. Mr. Speaker, I think it all underscores the fact that this is not acceptable. Expanding MAID for mental illness is not an appropriate treatment. It is not an appropriate solution for mental illness. What this government should be doing, Mr. Speaker, is instead of offering the mentally ill deaf, this government should be offering the mentally ill hope and support and the care that they deserve.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Cowichan-Malahat-Langford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank my colleague, the member for St. Albert Edmonton. I have served on the Special Joint Committee both in the previous Parliament and this one, and it was a lengthy amount of work, and certainly there was some very difficult testimony to go through. I don't want to cover the same ground that previous people asked questions on, but maybe I'll change tack. My friend, the member for Courtenay-Alberni, is our mental health and addictions critic, and he has constantly asked this government to bring mental health care funding up in parity with physical health care, understanding that there is, in fact, a real crisis. And if I look at the conditions in ridings like mine, where you see the opioids crisis and the way it has been ravaging communities, and the fact that there's so much underlying trauma and undiagnosed mental health disorders there that are not being addressed, I think, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to invite the member to comment on the fact that in the midst of this very difficult conversation, because I agree C-39 is a necessity, but we also have to take this opportunity and time to make sure that our system is appropriately resourced and funded so that we are getting those Canadians who are falling through the cracks. Thank you.
The honourable member for St. Albert Edmonton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I want to thank the member for Cowichan-Malahat-Langford, who has also contributed thoughtfully to the Special Joint Committee. And in answer to his question, I would note that during the 2021 election campaign, the Prime Minister claimed that mental health was a priority of his government, and he committed to a $4.5 billion mental health transfer. Mr. Speaker, none of that money has gone out the door. There is no mental health transfer. Instead of providing support and help, this government has been almost singularly focused on offering MAID to persons who are struggling with mental health. It speaks to how misplaced the priorities of this government are, and it also speaks to the fact that, once again, like so much of what the Prime Minister says, his words are nothing more than empty words.
We have time for a quick exchange. The honourable questions and comments. The honourable member for Foothills.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Quickly, I want to thank my colleague from St. Albert for the incredible work he did on that committee. I was able to sub in a couple of times and certainly impressed with his advocacy. But one of the things that has arisen lately is this government's officials offering MAID to our veterans. And I have a constituent who's one of those veterans who's an advocate, and this was very upsetting. And I just want to get his opinion on the slippery slope that this legislation is sending and the message it is sending for those vulnerable Canadians like those who have mental health issues. What is this legislation, what kind of message is this legislation sending to those vulnerable Canadians?
Great question.
The honourable member for St. Albert Edmonton.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the member for Foothills. The message that it is sending to persons who are struggling with mental illness is that your life is not important, that we're going to offer you death instead of help and support. And he raises the issue of veterans who were offered MAID completely inappropriately and frankly in contravention of the criminal code. And the Minister of Veterans Affairs, when they came to committee at Veterans Affairs, said that it had happened once or twice and that they had undertaken a thorough review. We now know that that isn't true, that it happened multiple times, and it speaks to, more broadly, to how this government has mishandled MAID in so many different ways.
Avant de continuer,